Those passages we read from the teachings of the new church about loving the truth for its own sake, I find pretty inspiring. Don't you want to be someone who loves the truth for its own sake and loves good for its own sake, and who loves the Lord and loves to live according to the truth? That sounds pretty great, right? Does it also sound unrealistic or unattainable? The idea of loving the truth for its own sake and loving goodness for its own sake shows up in a number of places in the Lord's Word, and so it seemed like a useful topic to try to understand more, particularly on a Holy Supper day, when we're already thinking about the topic of the goodness and the truth that we want to receive from the Lord and how we can be more receptive of what the Lord wants to give us. So to try to understand this better, we're going to read a few passages that contrast this with its opposite. Then we'll talk about how we can work toward this goal, and then finally we'll talk about a few connections with the Holy Supper. So let's look at the opposite of loving truth and good for their own sake. One passage from the teachings of the new church talks about signs that a person's sins are forgiven. Here's what it says. The signs that sins are forgiven are the following. Such people feel pleasure in worshiping God for God's sake, and in performing services for the neighbor's sake, and so in doing good for good's sake, and in speaking truth for truth's sake. They are unwilling to acquire merit by any charitable act or point of faith. They flee from and loathe evils, enmity, for example, or hatred, revenge, or adultery, and even thinking about such things with the intention of doing them. However, the signs that sins are not forgiven are the following. These people worship God, but not for God's sake. They perform services for the neighbor, but not for the neighbor's sake. So they do not do good or speak truth for the sake of good and truth, but for selfish and worldly reasons. They want to acquire merit by their deeds. They experience a not unpleasant feeling in evils, in enmity, for example, in hatred, revenge, and adultery, and as a result, they have no constraints in thinking about them. So, the opposite of loving truth and goodness for their own sake is loving them for how we can use them for our own selfish and worldly purposes. So, by analogy, here is a chunk of stone. And, what could we use this for? Well, we could use it to build an altar to put the word on. We could use it to build a whole building like this cathedral to worship the Lord in. But what else could we do with this same stone? Could cause a lot of damage by throwing it through a window or throwing it at some people. The same thing can be used in good ways for building or in harmful ways for destroying things. And the same, of course, applies for the Lord's truths. So let's imagine an unlikely but perhaps illustrative scenario. Imagine you told somebody, the new church teaches that God cannot turn away from us or even look at us with a frown. That's a beautiful, hopeful, important truth to know about the Lord our God. And then let's imagine that person turns around and says, man, how could anyone possibly believe in an angry God? They must be so stupid. Instead of loving the truth about the Lord for the truth of it and the goodness that's in that and using it to build a relationship with the Lord, that person's using that truth to serve their own ego and sense of superiority over other people. Now, maybe that example is not very likely, but you can probably think of other examples of people in history or last week using the Lord's truth to justify their evils, to make other people feel bad, all sorts of things, where we're using truth not for its intended purpose, and we're using goodness not for its intended purpose. So now let's talk about how we can work towards this goal of loving truth and goodness for their own sake. And one thing that's important is to have realistic expectations. The passage that talks about people loving truth for its own sake and loving goodness for their own sake are pretty clearly talking about people who are a fair way on their spiritual journey. People whose sins are forgiven. We don't start at that point. And people who have a new will are people who love these things. And the Lord does not expect us to immediately be at that stage. Listen to this passage from Secrets of Heaven, or Arcana Celestia, talking about the process that a person can go through. It says, "It does not matter if at first, when the formation starts to take place in the person, the affection for truth is also selfish and worldly. But this fault must be stripped away as good increases with the aid of truths. Also, from then on, the person is being unceasingly purged of those things, as the bowels are of waste matter. Anyone who thinks that a person can be endowed with the good of love without the truths of faith, and without leading a life in accordance with them, is much mistaken." It's saying it doesn't matter if part of our reason for liking truths at the beginning are somewhat selfish and worldly. If we keep trying to do what's right and live according to those truths, then the Lord can gradually get rid of those selfish things in us, just like our bodies regularly get rid of waste matter. If we keep on trying to live according to what the Lord teaches, then He'll be able to get us to the point of loving truth for its own sake. So it's a good ideal to aim toward, and it's okay if we're not quite there yet. Another important thing to know is that the route to loving truth and goodness for their own sake does not go by way of just taking what other people tell us at face value and saying, "That's what I believe now." We might think that that might be the spiritual or trusting thing to do, to just, instead of running the risk of messing with the truth by thinking about it for ourselves, we should just take it whole hog. Person in authority, person we like, we trust, just they say this is true, therefore it must be true. Good, we're spiritual then. No, that's not what the passages say. We can't outsource figuring out what the truth is if we're going to actually love the truth for ourselves. So this next passage talks about this a bit. It begins by talking about people who don't have a genuine affection for the truth, and then it talks about people who do have a genuine affection for the truth. Again, from Secrets of Heaven. "An affection for truth which is not genuine consists in willing and desiring truths for selfish reasons, that is, in order to acquire important positions and make monetary gain. Those with an affection for truth that has this origin do not care whether the truths they learn are genuine or not, provided they are such that can be palmed off as truths. This being so, they confine themselves to endorsing the teachings of the church in which they were born, regardless of whether those teachings are true or not. They are also in the dark so far as real truths are concerned, for worldly ends or gains and selfish ends or important positions make people completely blind. But people with a genuine affection for truth, that is, those who desire to know truths to put them to good use, and for the sake of the life they ought to lead, they too keep to the teachings of the church until they reach the age when they begin to think for themselves. Then they examine the scriptures and pray to the Lord for enlightenment, and when they receive it, their hearts rejoice." So part of loving the truth for its own sake is really wanting to know the truth so that we can put it to good use. Here's another passage that talks about the importance of an individual doing that individual work to see things for themselves. It says, "People who are moved by an affection for truth for its own sake and for their life's sake, consequently for the sake of the Lord's kingdom, do indeed have faith in the teachings of the church, but even so they examine the word closely with no other end in view than to see the truth itself, as a result of which they develop a faith and a conscience that are their own. If anyone tells them they ought to keep to the teachings of the church in which they were born, they then think that they would have been told exactly the same thing had they been born within Judaism, Quakerism, or even outside the church. This being what they think, they decide to examine the word closely, praying sincerely to the Lord for enlightenment as they do so. People like these do not disturb anyone else within the church, nor do they ever condemn others, for they recognize that the life led by everyone who is a church is founded on the faith that is his or her own." So those are some long passages, but they're so good, so I just wanted you to hear them directly. In the Holy Supper, you are the one coming to have supper with the Lord your God. He's offering his bread and his wine, his body and his blood to you. In certain moods and certain states, we can take things for granted. You may have heard certain stories and teachings from the Lord's Word countless times, and so you might find yourself a bit bored by some of them. But these truths are actually incredibly precious, and not everyone has easy access to them like we do. And it's also easy to take goodness for granted. having something useful to do that we get some enjoyment from, or having people that care about you and that you care about. Those are fairly normal, run-of-the-mill things, but also incredibly precious. We realize just how precious they are when we don't have them, when we don't feel loved or cared about, or don't feel like we have anything useful to do. So in the Holy Supper, the Lord offers us very normal bread and wine, but they represent something very precious. And Holy Supper can be a reminder for us of just how precious the Lord's goodness and the Lord's truth are, and how much we need them. There will be times when we mess up, times when we use the Lord's truth to make other people feel stupid, or when we try to twist the Lord's truth to make it say what we want it to say, and times when we'll take credit for goodness that actually belongs to the Lord, or do good things just to look good, to try to get people to do what we want. Those things will happen. Church on Sunday, and especially Holy Supper, provides us a chance to come back to the Lord, to acknowledge where we've messed up, and to ask Him to help us do better next time. And the Lord will gradually give us a love for truth's sake, and a love for good's sake. Great peace have those who love the Lord's law, and for them there is no stumbling. Amen.